When I first tested the Nintendo Switch 2 6 months ago, I discovered that most users would experience a washed-out HDR picture with blown-out highlights when playing the console in docked mode, because of a few issues that make the Adjust HDR settings on the Switch 2 almost impossible to configure correctly. I even went to the trouble of creating a nits chart, so that interested viewers can get a better HDR gaming experience from the Nintendo Switch 2. Well, the chart is now as useless as a swimsuit in the Sahara, because Nintendo has released a system update that has improved many elements of the Adjust HDR process. Improvement number 1 is that the actual peak brightness figure you're adjusting in the first screen with two suns can now be displayed by pressing the Y button on the Joy-Con, so you no longer need to count the number of clicks to obtain a certain peak brightness figure or max TML value for your TV, monitor or projector. As expected, based on cross-referencing the brightness slider in Cyberpunk 2077 before this peak brightness readout was added through a system update, each click up or down on the first Adjust HDR screen on the Nintendo Switch 2 corresponds to exactly 10 nits. The numbers also align with the inbuilt HDR analysis tool on my Canon reference monitor. For example, if we increased the peak brightness value to 1000 nits, it would measure 1000 nits on the reference monitor. If we crank it up to 4000 nits, then the reference monitor would also show precisely 4000 nits, which means that my monitor is working well, and I've not wasted tens of thousands of pounds. The peak brightness value would max out at 10,000 nits, which is of course the ceiling for the HDR10 PQ standard. Improvement number 2 can be found on the second Adjust HDR screen, which lets you set the diffuse white or HDR reference white level, also commonly known as paper white in many HDR games. Previously, the default paper white figure set by Nintendo on the Switch 2 in docked mode was far too bright, for instance coming in at 500 nits if the max TML value was configured to 1000 nits on the first Adjust HDR screen, which is significantly brighter than the reference white level of 203 nits recommended by the ITUR BT2408 standard for 1000 nit HDR10 content, leading to a perceptually flatter image where midtones are pushed too high, hence reducing dynamic range and leaving insufficient headroom for specular highlights. Following the latest system update, Nintendo has lowered the default paper white setting to a more sensible 300 nits, mostly independently of the peak brightness value. Let me illustrate. If we leave peak brightness at its default value of 900 nits on the first Adjust HDR screen with two suns, press OK to go across to the second screen, then press Y to bring up the adjustment slider, you can see the default paper white value hovering at around 300 nits. If we increase peak brightness on the first screen to 1000 nits, then go to the second screen, the default paper white setting in this configuration still stays at 300 nits. Let's try setting peak brightness to 4000 nits, which already exceeds the peak luminance capabilities of my Canon reference monitor. That's why you can't see both suns at all. And on the second Adjust HDR screen, you can see that the default paper white setting remained at 300 nits. Even increasing peak brightness to the maximum of 10,000 nits did not cause the subsequent default paper white value to deviate from 300 nits. Of course, if you lower the peak brightness setting on the first Adjust HDR screen to 300 nits, which is what I would recommend for some of the brighter projectors out there, such as the Valerian Vision Master Max, then naturally the default paper white value has to go lower than 300 nits to allow some headroom for specular highlight expression. Now, some of you may know that this system update has been available for a while, but I haven't had the chance to cover it until now because I've been in Asia attending pre-CES briefings for upcoming 2026 TVs. And whenever I'm traveling in that part of the world, one app I consistently rely on is Ubigi, which lets you download an eSIM data plan across more than 200 destinations. The funny thing is, I had happily used Ubigi purely off my own research when I went to Tokyo for a Sony media briefing a couple of years ago, long before Ubigi approached me for this collaboration. What I appreciate is how you can set everything up before leaving the UK. I installed the eSIM at home, and upon landing, all I had to do was to select Ubigi as my data source and enable data roaming. It activated automatically, and I was online straight away without needing to queue or swap physical SIM cards. And because it's data only, there are no surprise roaming charges. So if you want a reliable, stress-free way to stay connected on your next trip, download the Ubigi app and use my promo code HDTV test for a 10% discount. The link is in the YouTube description below. Thanks again for your support. Okay, for many gamers, a paperwhite setting of 300 nits would probably be suitable for playing in a very bright or even moderately bright room. So you can just set the first adjust HDR screen correctly for your TV or monitor and leave the second screen alone. However, when playing HDR games in a dimly lit room, I still found 300 nits paperwhite to be a bit too bright and washed out, so I would seek to lower it to 200 nits as per ITU BT2408 recommendation. And herein lies improvement number 3 that has been implemented by Nintendo with the latest software update. If you have set the peak brightness number on the first adjust HDR screen to be 900 nits or higher, then the paperwhite nit value changed by each click on the second screen would be the same instead of being variable depending on the peak brightness values. To set paperwhite to 200 nits, just lower the adjustment slider all the way left to 50 nits, then go right by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 clicks. That will give you a paperwhite value of 200 nits, which injected more pop and depth to the HDR picture to our eyes. So with all these new changes in mind following the latest system update, how should you configure the HDR settings on the Nintendo Switch 2 in docked mode correctly for your display? If you have a TV or monitor with HDRG support or whose tone mapping can be disabled completely, then first engage HDRG on your TV or monitor. After that, go to the first adjust HDR screen. Go down until both suns are clearly visible. From here, gradually go up, one click at a time. As soon as the sun on the right disappears, stop. The sun on the left should still be clearly visible at this point. If you are playing in a reasonably bright room, there's no need to adjust the default paperwhite setting after the latest firmware update from Nintendo, and you can just press the OK button to save the settings. However, if you are playing in a dark room or prefer more image depth, then just follow my instructions earlier to adjust the paperwhite value to 200 nits, again remembering to press the OK button instead of the back button to save the settings. If you are using a TV or monitor without proper HDRG support, one good rule of thumb is to set peak brightness on the first adjust HDR screen to 1000 nits and paperwhite on the second screen to around 200 nits. It's not 100% perfect, but it's a solid catch-all that should minimize clipping while preserving contrast. Needless to say though, HDR games would still look more accurate and impactful on a display that supports HDRG or source-based tone mapping, mainly by avoiding unnecessary double tone mapping which can dull the highlights and flatten the picture. To find out exactly how to enable HDRG on some of the more popular TV and monitor brands such as LG or Samsung, please watch my instruction video by clicking here.